Hi, my name's Nikki, the Obsessive Bookseller, and welcome to today's review of The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is book one in the Bloodsworn series, and I'm sure you've heard of it. If you watch any kind of booktube, this one has definitely crossed your radar. And I perhaps picked it up a little sooner than I had intended because it got chosen for not one, but two book clubs that I'm involved in. So I read it for both, and yeah, it's awesome when it works out like that. I went into this book incredibly skeptical because it has so much hype. People are loving it. And it's a lot of the same people who have read the Malice, the Faithful and the Fallen series by the same author. And so I was wondering how much of that praise is because of its own merit and how much is just ongoing love for the author. But color me surprised, this book was every bit as good as people say it is. This is probably one of the slowest moving stories I've read in a while. Very slow burn, heavily character-driven novel. But to me it never felt boring because the author has a whole bunch of really unique ideas in here that I've never read, at least done well before. I think the element of craft that I am most impressed by is the way in which he released information to me as a reader. So it was very careful placements of reveals. He definitely does not do info dumps, but instead incorporates the things we ought to know into the book very gradually. And it was just enough so that every 2 or 3 chapters or so, I found a new point of interest, like new information that I latched onto that kept me wanting to read more to find out more. And I thought it was brilliant. He essentially left me breadcrumbs through the whole book to keep me going, and I loved it. Each new thing I learned, I was like, oh, I need to talk about this with someone. Like, it's that kind of cool stuff that really kind of has you reeling a little bit. The book bounces really evenly between 3 POVs, and I was on board with 2 of them right from the beginning, but the third one took me until about the halfway point before I finally was like, okay, yes, I am interested in this character. Because this is such a deep character study book, you really get in depth with these people. I wouldn't necessarily call them relatable because we're dealing with extremes of human behavior based on the weird circumstances in which they find themselves in here. The way they respond, these intelligent characters who can kind of deduce the situation and make good decisions, but they're still human enough to make mistakes, which is a really hard balance to achieve sometimes. I thought it was done really well. So they weren't relatable in their personas, but they were in their humanity, if that makes sense. And I am more and more appreciating how John Gwynne writes female characters. So many times in fantasy, if a female character is strong or capable, it's highlighted as something remarkable in the world. Whereas these female characters are just downright badass, unapologetically, and they take care of business. And written by a male author, they still feel incredibly feminine, even though they're warriors, which is really refreshing to read. Typically, when I'm evaluating a fantasy novel, world building is really high up on my checkmark list, and no exception here. And the world building here is so odd, narrowly focused on these characters, and so the expansive world building going on here feels almost at the periphery of the story, and yet, as you read, you realize it is completely integral to everything that's going on in the story. Even though you don't get a lot of explanation, even though there's so many questions I have that I can't wait to be answered, but he is so precise with his placement of information that I have complete faith, like complete faith, that all of these questions are going to be answered in future books. And I can't wait for the reveal. Like every new discovery, I'm like, oh, I want to keep going. Love it. The only thing of note I feel inclined to point out is the pacing of this novel. It's a very interesting pacing, so incredibly slow through the first like 50 to 75% of the book, but not boring. That's the thing for me, never boring. But it seems like the people who are having a hard time with it are not invested in the characters. So I think latching onto these characters and being invested is completely key to enjoying the story. If you don't have that, then it's going to be a hard read. Near the end, the pacing kind of got a little odd because we'd been on this slow burn this whole journey, and suddenly we're trying to culminate everybody's stories at different increments. So you get this like huge spike of momentum, and then we switch POVs, and then you spike the momentum again, and then it's just like a platform of all this action happening. So it was a little disjointed for me, but that is a very minor complaint in the whole scheme of things. Overall, I'm really glad that circumstances had me picking up this book sooner than later because I enjoyed the heck out of it. And I am landing at a 4.5 out of 5 stars, which is incredibly high praise. Okay, let's talk about other books you might like. Upon reflecting about Shadow of the Gods, what stands out most is harsh circumstances, people pushed to their limits, but still having to deal with like local politics and kind of like fight for their right to exist in this world. The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, it's one of the quote standalones, but really I wouldn't recommend reading it out of order. That's just me. Kind of has all of those elements, with perhaps a cheekier delivery and overall much levity to the story, as opposed to Shadow of the Gods, which took itself very seriously. But if the blood spilling and local politics was your favorite part of Shadow of the Gods, this would be an excellent pick. Oh, and the setting too, the North, very hostile place, so yeah, good crossover. Waking Fire by Anthony Ryan, and I'm suggesting this one because both series have this overarching shadow of a threat. And so everything starts out pretty focused on the characters, but you know there's this bigger conflict looming and something that's very ominous feeling, and I feel like very similar circumstances to here. Only if you struggled with the characterization and pacing in that one, this one clicks along a lot faster, and it has a cool magic system based on dragon blood to boot, so what's not to love? And the atmosphere that I'm relating to between these two series comes a lot from the second and third book, not necessarily this first one, but I think from a writing style standpoint, it's still pretty comparable. Emperor's Blades by Brian Staveley. I'm suggesting this one because Shadow of the Gods was a very rich cultural experience. It completely transported me to this world with these characters. And this one did very much the same. Very exotic locations, really cool world building, the giant kestrel birds. Yeah, kind of a lot of cool crossovers there. The difference is I like the training sequences in this one, but Shadow of the Gods had those as well, which was pretty cool. And the characters in Shadow of the Gods are much more savvy. So let's get that out on the table right away. We are not dealing with the sharpest tools in the shed in this one. However, I still absolutely loved it. One of my all-time favorite books. And, pretty comparable in atmosphere and story presentation. Probably my number one recommend, if you liked the indigenous, totally brutal aspect of the story with relatively slow pacing, this is a good pick. What strikes me about Gwynne is that his writing is incredibly evoking. He really takes his time to drag you along with the emotions of these characters and kind of rip your soul out along the way, really make you understand why they're doing the things they're doing. And this book, probably the most brilliantly written thing I have read from Salvatore to date. He has really upped his game since he started back in the 80s. As makes sense, obviously. If you spend that long writing, you obviously get better at it, but yeah, I was wildly impressed with this. It's the reason I went back and picked up where I left off with the Drizzt series, because I'm wow, if this is the kind of quality that he's writing these days, I definitely want to go back and see what he's done in the Drizzt world. Similar setting, similar brutal themes. This one is probably a lot more narrowly focused. We're dealing with just this one indigenous tribe, as opposed to in the Shadow of the Gods, which is a lot more expansive, but yeah, I thought as far as the feeling I got while reading the books were very similar for both of these. And it didn't occur to me until I was talking about that other one that I have 2 Salvatores on the list. So if you like the atmosphere for In the Shadow of the Gods, but didn't think the characters were any fun, didn't connect to it, wanted a little bit more adventure and levity, then perhaps you might like the Icewind Dale trilogy by R.A. Salvatore. Chronologically, it was the first one written in the Legend of Drizzt. There is a prequel trilogy that comes before this, which honestly I recommend reading first, but if you're just wanting the cold north, people trying to survive, fun battle scenes, whatever, then this is a good pick. But as I mentioned with Salvatore, the stuff that he wrote a little earlier on isn't quite as strong as the stuff he's writing now, so This is definitely a lighthearted read, but you can't talk about cold settings and fun characters without mentioning Icewind Dale, so that's my last pick. Great, thank you so much for joining me on this review. I appreciate you being here, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye.